Kanchanaburi Death Railway Museum and Research Center visit August 2025. Here is the entrance to the museum. This museum is dedicated to those men and women who suffered directly and indirectly as a result of the construction of the Thailand-Burma Railway. Major A. E. Saggers of the Malay hamlet in June 1943 said, "Never have I dreamt that I would see the day when human life would be held so cheaply." The first panel, titled, "Why Build the Railway?" Japan gained a foothold in China during World War I when it captured the German fortress of Tsingtao in northeast China. The Japanese army subsequently became well established in Shantung and Manchuria, and by the mid-1930s, Manchuria had become the Japanese protectorate of Manchukuo. The Japanese envisaged a similar fate for the whole of China. However, further territorial demands by the Japanese upon a divided and weak China subsequently led to war. In an attempt to force Japan to end this war, Britain, Holland, and the United States imposed a trade embargo on Japan. At the same time, they provided the Chinese forces, led by Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, with armaments and supplies via a road, the Burma Road, across the foothills of the Himalayas from Lashio, a railhead in Burma, to Kunming and Chongqing in China. In order to cut this vital supply link and to obtain for themselves the raw materials of Burma, oil and wolfram, the Japanese needed to enter and occupy Burma. Because the terrain along the Thailand-Burma border was extremely mountainous, no roads suitable for the movement of heavy artillery and tanks existed. So the attack on Burma was carried out using infantry and pack animals. Even the shallow pass through the mountains of the Three Pagodas Pass had nothing more than a walking track. Hence, the only route available to supply the Japanese army in Burma was by sea from Japan to Rangoon, via Singapore and the Straits of Malacca. When the Allied forces operating from Ceylon began attacking their ships in the Andaman Sea, the Japanese quickly realized the need for a safe land route. The linking of the railway network of Thailand to that of Burma would allow supplies to be sent from Japanese Bangkok by sea and thence by rail through the link into the Burmese rail system. This is a map of the Japanese advances during the early part of World War II in the Pacific. Here are Japanese troops advancing in the Philippines. Here are Japanese troops attacking Singapore. Here are a few of the civilian casualties of the bombing of Singapore. Here is some of the destruction at Pearl Harbor. Here is some of the destruction of the airfields in Hawaii. This image is of the destruction of shipping by aerial bombing. The next information board, Japanese expansion. 1931 September, contrived clash between Japanese and Chinese troops leads to the occupation of Burma. 1933 February, Japan withdraws from the League of Nations after being censured over its aggression in China. 1937, July, the Marco Polo Bridge incident precipitates full-scale war between Japan and China. 1939, February. Japan invades Hainan Island. September, Germany invades Poland. Britain and France declare war on Germany. 1940, April. Germany invades Denmark and Norway. May, Germany invades the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. The French Republic falls in June. September, the Rome-Berlin axis is extended to include Tokyo. The French Vichy government permits Japan to establish bases in Indochina, from where it attacks China. 1941, June. Germany invades Russia. Japan and Russia sign a non-aggression pact. December 8th, 7th December, east of the international date line. Japan invades Hong Kong, Malaya, and Thailand, bombs Pearl Harbor and airfields in the Philippine Islands. December 10th, HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse sunk, giving Japan total command of the Western Pacific Ocean. Japan invades the Philippine Islands. December 16th, Japan invades southern Burma from Thailand. 1942, January 21st, Japan and Thailand sign a treaty of cooperation. January 25th, Thailand declares war on America and Britain. January 31st, Malaya captured by the Japanese. February 15th, Singapore surrenders. February 19th, bombing raids on Darwin. February 27th, Battle of the Java Sea results in defeat of the Allied naval forces. February 28th, HMAS Perth and USS Houston sunk in the Sunda Strait. Japan invades Java. March 8, Rangoon captured. Japanese forces invade New Guinea. March 9, Dutch forces surrender on Java. April 8th, American and Philippine forces surrender at Bataan. The next invasion board, the invasion of Burma. The Japanese had two reasons for moving speedily into Burma. Firstly, the need to cut the Burma Road, carrying vital supplies to the Chinese forces. Secondly, there were wolfram mines at Mauchi and oil fields at Yinangyuan. The topography of the border between Thailand and Burma, with no railways or paved roads, precluded the movement of heavy armaments. These could only be carried by sea to Rangoon. The most direct route from Japan to Rangoon by sea was via Singapore and the Malacca Straits. The Burma Road was a highway in southwestern China, extending 720 kilometers from Kunming, capital of Yunnan province, to the railhead at Lashio in Burma. In April 1942, the Japanese captured Lashio and gained control of the road. The initial Japanese invasion of Burma was made on the 16th December 1941 from southern Thailand, aimed at capturing the British airfields at Victoria Point. Later, Japanese forces crossed into Burma through the Three Pagodas Pass at Mae Sot. Rangoon was captured on 9th March. By the end of May 1942, British forces had been driven back across the Indian border. Here are Japanese troops entering Burma through Thailand. Here is a detailed map of the early operations in the Burma Campaign. Here is greater detail of what the map indicates. Number 1. After the Japanese cut the first road, a second road was built by forces under General Vinegar Joe Stilwell. It was opened in January 1945. 2. The Burma Road was built by beleaguered Chinese forces in 1937 to 1938. It was used to carry vital British and American supplies to the Chinese armies. 3. The Japanese 55th Division entered Burma at Mae Sot in January 1942. Steep terrain forced them to use pack animals, hence they had to leave all their heavy weapons in Bangkok. 4. Lack of proper road and rail access to the rest of Burma from Victoria Point limited the initial Japanese attack solely to the capture of airfields from which to attack Malaya. Planning the railway. In 1939, Japanese Imperial Headquarters carried out a survey on the construction and use of a railway linking Thailand to Burma. The conclusion reached was that, despite the problem of greater length, the route joining Bangkok directly to the Andaman Sea was the better of several alternatives. The same alternatives as studied by the British many years before and rejected because of the many difficulties. Japanese military planning for the occupation of Southeast Asia always included the use of the region's railways, and to this end, railway units were a part of the Japanese army. In 1942, soon after the Japanese and Thai governments had signed their cooperation agreement, Major General Hattori Shinpei ordered a survey made of the route from Kanchanaburi to the Three Pagodas. In March 1942, using his authority as commanding officer of Southern Region Army's 2 Railway Control, Major General Hattori ordered that preparations begin for the construction of a railway linking Nong Pladok in Thailand to Tham Bu Zayat in Burma. He foresaw the urgency of the situation and acted without waiting for the instructions from Imperial Japanese headquarters. During the planning of this railway link, the railway engineers considered the many problems facing them: difficult terrain, climatic and health conditions, logistics, and the large amount of work involved, and made decisions based on their appreciation of these problems. One important factor considered was the use of heavy construction machinery, and this was rejected on the grounds of the almost impossible logistics of transporting, using, and maintaining such equipment. So the scene was set for the employment of hundreds of thousands of unwilling workers. The disaster that overtook the Japanese at the Battle of Midway in 1942 ensured that there would be no carrier-based forays into the Indian Ocean. Thus, the voyage around the Malay Peninsula to Rangoon became an increasingly perilous undertaking for the few Japanese merchant transports that could be spared to risk its dangers. With a large army now in control of Burma, the Imperial Japanese headquarters ordered the construction of the Thai-Burma Rail Link to begin. Because much of the preliminary work had already been done, the Imperial Japanese Army, the UA, was able to commence work on the project soon after this construction order was issued in June 1942. Another factor considered by the Japanese was the use of Allied prisoners as laborers on the project. Initial plans called for the use of 100,000 POWs within the total of 60,000 laborers required. The Japanese also realized that the dispersal of POWs to many parts of the Japanese Empire would reduce the threat posed by the large groups of Allied personnel under their control. Dutch prisoners of war working in a Japanese factory. British POW pushing an ore skip in a copper mine at Kinkaseki, Formosa, Taiwan. Kawanami shipbuilding yards, Japan. Camp at North Point, Hong Kong, for Canadian prisoners of war. A jungle camp in Thailand for prisoners building the Thailand-Burma Railway. Wreckage of a locomotive on the route of the POWs built railway in Sumatra. This is a map showing the routes of the Japanese dispersal of Allied prisoners of war. It also includes ships that were sunk that contained POWs. Next is the details on the insets. Prisoners of the Japanese. There were 176 prisoner of war, POW, camps within the Japanese home islands. Its Asian possessions held 500 more. Arrows show the specific movements of POWs to and from Singapore, including those involved in the construction of the Thailand-Burma Railway. Legend for the major POW troop movements. Ships carrying POWs sunk. 1. Montevideo Maru. 2. Toyofuku Maru. 3. Lisbon Maru. 4. Nichime Maru. 5. Suez Maru. 6. Tamahoko Maru. 7. Harukiku Maru. 8. Haragiku Maru. 9. Rakuyo Maru. 10. Kachidoki Maru. 11. Shinyo Maru. 12. Junyu Maru. 13. Fukai Maru. 14. Hofuku Maru. 15. Harisan Maru. 16. Eiko Maru. 17. Oryoku Maru. 18. Enora Maru. 19. Brazil Maru. 20. PS number 3. 21. PS number 4. Planning the route. Japanese Planning Conference in Kanchanaburi. Japanese engineers exploring the River Kwai. Japanese Planning Conference in Kanchanaburi. A map of the planned Thailand-Burma Railway, including existing railways, international boundaries, and rivers. The next information board, beginning the railway. Soon after Major General Hattori ordered the survey of a possible railway route from Kanchanaburi to the Three Pagodas in February 1942, the Japanese began active preparations for the construction of that railway. In April, one railway materials workshops set up base camps at Nong Pladuk in Thailand and Thambuzayat in Burma, and began stockpiling construction materials and mechanical equipment. At the same time, the two railway construction units responsible for building the railway were moving to their respective base camps. This is a Japanese supply base in Thailand. This is an air photograph showing the River Kwai and mountainous terrain. Japanese engineers in Kanchanaburi. 5 Railway Regiment was to start at Thambuzayat and work southwards, and 9 Railway Regiment, with headquarters in Kanchanaburi, was to be responsible for building the railway northwards to Konkoita. When the first construction engineers arrived in Bangkok on 13th May 1942, they found aerial photographs of the proposed route already available, and within 3 days set out to begin the detailed construction survey. In June, the first prisoners of war, 5 trainloads of British troops totaling 3,000 men, arrived at Ban Pong to start work on clearing and building the base workshops and railway sidings at Nong Pladuk. By October, more than 14,000 British prisoners of war were in Thailand. Meanwhile, the first prisoners, 3,000 Australians of A Force, and British and Dutch prisoners from Sumatra, had arrived at Thambuzayat to start work in Burma. The next information board, titled Perfidy. Most of the groups, include leaving Changi, were told by the Japanese that they were going to areas where conditions were better than those existing in Singapore. With the early groups, the fact that this was not so had little bearing on the eventual fate of the prisoners selected for these groups. However, by the time F Force, which is a group of 3,660 Australians and 3,340 British POWs, was being formed in April 1943, very few men remained fit in Changi. This was not considered to be a major problem, since the POW command was assured by the Japanese that 1. The climate of the new location would be similar to that of Singapore. 2. The force would be distributed over 7 camps, each of 1,000 men. All camps would be pleasant, healthy surroundings. 3. Sufficient medical personnel to staff a 300-bed hospital would be included. 4. As many blankets and mosquito nets as possible were to be taken by individuals, and more of these items would be issued after arrival. 5. A band would accompany each group of 1,000 men. 6. Canteens would be established within 3 weeks of the concentration of the men at their destination. 7. No restriction would be placed on the amount of personal equipment to be taken. Officers could take their trunks and valises. 8. Tools and cooking gear to maintain the force were to be taken. This included an electric generating set for the hospital and Air Force headquarters. 9. Transport would be available for the cartage of heavy personal equipment, camp and medical stores, and unfit men. 10. There would be no long marches. The reality was very different. The Japanese transported their captives from Singapore to Thailand in railway boxcars, slightly longer than this replica. About 28 men and their equipment were locked in each boxcar for the 4 days and nights of the journey. These statues of soldiers making the train trip from Singapore to Thailand are to honor the memory of NX 10862 Private William Nin Fing of the 2nd of the 30th Battalion, AIF, and all others who slaved on the railway. TBRC Company Limited is indebted to the family of NX 18176 Private Jeffrey Alcock of the 2nd of the 30th Battalion, AIF, and to Executive Excellence of Brisbane, Australia, for their generosity in providing the funds to allow these statues to be created. A comfort stop en route to Thailand. More about perfidy. The hopes and aspirations of the men selected for work parties leaving Singapore were quickly dashed, almost as soon as they were forced into the steel railway boxcars or confined in tiered layers in ships' holds. Those who traveled to Thailand by train were crammed 28 to a closed freight wagon approximately 7 meters long, as well as the men themselves. There were their personnel equipment, a share of the group's community gear, and Japanese equipment. For the 4 days and nights of the dreadful trip to Thailand, it was impossible to lie down completely to sleep. With the only ventilation coming from the single sliding door, the days were spent in oven-like agony, broken only by the occasional stop when the locomotives required food or water. The nights, by contrast, were very cold. As well as these extreme conditions, the Japanese provided very little food and water throughout the trip north, some groups going for more than 40 hours without a meal. Then, on arrival at Ban Pong, the harsh reality of conditions in Thailand was driven home. Those who arrived in the dry season of 1942-1943 were greeted by a dust bowl. These were the more fortunate, since those who arrived during the rains marched into a swamp of black mud and waste from overflowing latrines. Another look at the POWs in the boxcar. This map shows the arrival of the POWs by train and by sea. The white dotted lines are the arrival routes. The next information panel, titled The Land of Milk and Honey. What some men saw when they first arrived in Thailand or Burma may have given the impression that the Japanese promises that they were being moved to locations where conditions were better and food was plentiful were true. One large group of POWs was not met by Japanese guards when they arrived in Kanchanaburi. They were able to spend a week selling possessions and trading with Thai vendors. When the guards did arrive, it took 2 days to round up the prisoners. A member of D Force wrote, "Everywhere groups of men boiled billies and brewed coffee, fried eggs and bananas, and sweated over hot frying pans." Food vendors. Kanchanaburi, Thailand. Street scene in Mulmine, Burma. They started to tear tobacco, cheroots, fruit, and foodstuffs of all kinds from the stalls. Disregarding the Japanese, they thrust them into our hands. This was also from a member of D Force. 2 malarias and a cholera. This statue, based on a drawing by Ray Parkin, was generously donated by the Thailand-Burma Railway Center by the people of the Netherlands through the kind offices of the Royal Netherlands Embassy. Ray Parkin from Dunlop Force wrote, "During the forenoon, 2 men collapsed with malaria. Being in charge of this gang, I was able to get them Yasumid, rested. During the dinner break, 2 more went down with stomach trouble. One of them, I was certain, had cholera. He could not walk. After much haggling, the nip corporal said they could go back to camp. With the 2 malaria standing up, I got the cholera between them, his arms about their necks. They made a wobbly tripod. I watched them go. They were bowed and sweating with pain and concentration, trying not to collapse. The man with cholera was limp between them, with his head on his chest, hanging like a crucified man. His knees were buckled and his feet lifeless. As the others dragged him along with their slow, shambling gait, his ripped trousers, unbuttoned at the waistband, kept falling about his knees. Here is the statue of the 3 men. The next information panels are about the railway design. First is design. In the earlier years of the 20th century, many Japanese engineers attended British universities and gained practical experience before returning to Japan. The nature of the terrain in Japan had ensured that Japanese railway engineers had become very experienced in building railways through mountainous terrain. The men chosen to design the Thailand-Burma rail link were both military personnel with extensive railway engineering experience in China and Korea, and civilian engineers mobilized for the war effort. The biggest problem for the Japanese was not whether they could build the railway, but rather whether they could build it in the time required, using the resources available. The design guidelines, based on the performance of the locomotives to be used, were a gauge of 1 meter, standard throughout Southeast Asia. Load liability of 15 tons per rail. Maximum gradient of 25 for 1,000. Minimum radius of curvature of 200 meters. Track surface to be 4 to 5 meters wide. Timber railway sleepers 15 every 10 meters. Stations to be within 10 kilometers apart. Planning. In the 1890s, when the British had thought about building a railway through Burma and Thailand, the population of the 2 countries was only a fraction of what it was by 1942. In 1895, Thailand had 5 million people. So, should the British have gone ahead with the project, they would have had to import a large number of coolies from India. By mid-1942, the Japanese faced no similar problems. They had several 100,000 prisoners of war and were prepared to use these men wherever and however they wanted. They also had control of all of Southeast Asia and its large human resource. In Malaya, there were large numbers of unemployed Tamil laborers, formerly employed by the British. Initially, these workers were enticed into working for the Japanese by the offer of an employment contract. Later, when volunteers were not forthcoming, more forceful means of recruitment were employed. Initially, the situation in Burma was very different. With the removal of the British, the new Burmese administration was firmly under Japanese control, and for a number of reasons, this administration took an active part in the recruitment of laborers for the Japanese. Materials. The acquisition of materials for the railway did not prove to be any more difficult than obtaining the labor. As part of their war preparations, the Japanese had readied almost 100 locomotives and their rolling stock for shipment to Southeast Asia. Almost half of these locomotives were landed in Bangkok in January 1942 and were put to use on the railway to Singapore as soon as that line was repaired after the British forces retreated. The plans for the railway to Burma called for the use of locally available material wherever possible, and any shortfall being made up with material from Japan. During the British retreat down Malaya, the East Coast Railway was so badly damaged that the Japanese decided that it was better to lift the line and use the rails, bridges, and other materials on the new rail link rather than repair it. Smaller quantities of track materials and rolling stock were taken from the Netherlands, East Indies, and Burma. The most significant of all this material taken by the Japanese was a bridge dismantled in Java and transported to Thailand, later to become world famous as the Bridge on the River Kwai. The next information board, construction. Hammer and tap. Hit, lift, and turn. Hit, lift, and turn. Clean out the dust. Pour in a little water. Clink, 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 and slowly the hole deepens. Fill with dynamite. Explode. Carry away the rock and start again. And building embankments. Building embankments. Ray Parkin of the HMAS Perth wrote, "Basket by basket, tanka by tanka, we carry the earth which had to be scratched from between the rocks in the jungle, tramping it out to the slowly forming bank." Ray Parkin of the HMAS Perth also wrote, "It was like the Tower of Babel, Tamils, Chinese, Malays, English, and Australians, and the Japanese herding us about, shouting the local pidgin, and underlining phrases with bamboo rods." This model shows a railway cutting under construction. The next information panel is about trestle bridges. Here is one of the many trestle bridges that were built. Parts of an actual trestle bridge. This plaque reads, "Look up, trestle bridge largely reconstructed from materials recovered from the abandoned railway." Trestle bridges. There were 680 timber trestle bridges along the 415-kilometer length of the railway. All were built to a standard design used throughout the world as illustrated in the American Civil Engineers Handbook. The only remaining examples of these bridges are the 4 rebuilt bridges at Tham Krasai, which is wartime Wang Pho, and several photographs of wartime bridges under construction and completed exist in Japanese records and are now held in the archives of this museum. There are also drawings of the bridges in several prisoner of war books. In May 2009, the creator of this museum located remains of 2 of the bridges when the waters of the dam covering 40 kilometers of the old railway route fell to an unusually low level. A number of the timbers from one of these bridges was subsequently recovered, and the timber below this panel is one of the pier caps, shown in blue in the drawing. The model above, also using some original timbers, is a simplified version of a trestle bridge to show the method of construction. The trestle bridge model. A sketch of the POWs building the trestle bridge. The American Civil Engineers Manual. A trestle design from the manual adapted by the Japanese for use on the railway. And a picture of Japanese engineers involved in the construction of a trestle bridge. Japanese photographs of trestle bridges under construction and one completed. Remnants of a trestle bridge at Thimongata, May 2009. Logistics. When one considers the quantity of materials required to build the railway, its remoteness, and the difficulties of transport, it seems surprising that the project was completed in the time that it was. However, it is not so surprising if one realizes that the Japanese were excellent planners and improvisers. An example of this can be seen in the way the Japanese supplied cement to many of the construction sites. The idea of transporting cement in wooden barrels was not new. What may have been new was the idea of premixing the cement, sand, and gravel first, then transporting this to the barrels, in the barrels. Was the Thailand-Burma Railway the first construction project where premixed concrete was used? A diorama of POWs building a railway cutting. More of the diorama of the railway cutting construction. These railway spikes were recovered from the locations indicated during the exploration of the railway. Locations along the railway at the time: Nong Pladuk, Ban Pong. More of Nong Pladuk, Ban Pong. Kanchanaburi, the Kanchanaburi War Cemetery, around 1950. Tha Makam, the bridge over the River Kwai, destroyed by Allied bombing, June 1945. Bridge over the River Kwai as repaired post-war. Note the marks from bomb damage on the bridge piers. Chung Kai. Wang Fo. The wooden viaduct at Wang Fo is still in service. Kan Yu. Hin Tok. There were 680 trestle bridges along the railway. All were built in the same design as this three-tier bridge. Kinsai Yok. Prang Kasi. The river was the railway construction project's supply line. A tiny symbol of a nation's ambitions. Tha Kanun, mountainous terrain through which the railway was built. The Golden Spike. On 25th October 1943, at Konkoita, 262 kilometers from Nong Pladuk, the Japanese held an official joining of the rails ceremony. The commanding officers of the 5th and 9th Railway Regiments, Lieutenant Colonels Sasaki and Imai, drove specially made gunmetal dog spikes into an ebony sleeper to signify the joining of the rails. After the rails were joined, a Japanese locomotive, C5631, with crossed Japanese flags on the front, pulling several open wagons filled with senior Japanese officers, traveled slowly across the junction from the south. This locomotive is now on display at the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo. This golden spike, made to commemorate the joining, was donated to the Thailand-Burma Railway Center by Mr. Renichi Sugano, a former officer of the 9th Railway Regiment of the Imperial Japanese Army. Shimo Sonkurai, and the remains of a wartime road bridge. 3 pagodas. The impassable roads caused major supply problems in areas beyond river transport. 7 of the 8 steel bridges constructed along the railway were in Burma. Mezali, Dutch cemetery in the jungle. The Flying Kampong. Japanese preparations for the war in Southeast Asia included the manufacture of trucks, which could run on railways as well as on roads. This was achieved by fitting a flange and running surface on the rear wheel brake drums and being able to replace the front axle with a small pivoting bogie. When the truck arrived at a railway, the road wheels were removed and it was lowered onto the tracks, onto the rails. Some of these truck trains were camouflaged to look like bamboo and atap huts. These strange-looking trains were soon nicknamed Flying Kampongs by Allied soldiers who saw them passing by. This model has been made with the kind assistance of members of the Defence Reserves Association, Australia, Tours of Thailand. Another look at the trestle bridge model with the Flying Kampong on it. Steel components recovered from a trestle bridge site. The next information board, titled Living. Here's a closer look at the text on the board, subtitled Movement. On arrival at Ban Pong, or Dambu Zayat, some groups of workers were fortunate enough to be transported to their work areas. Most, however, were forced to march. In the early stages of construction, this was not a major problem, since the distance to be marched was short and was done during the dry season. By early 1943, the situation was changing for the worse. Many of the workers were arriving in an already weakened state after living under Japanese control for more than a year. The distances to march were longer, up to 300 kilometers. Then in April, the rain started. The group of Allied prisoners of war to suffer most from this was F Force. This group of 7,000 British and Australians had to march 300 kilometers at night, carrying all their personal equipment, medical and camp stores, Japanese stores, and their own sick. This march lasted 17 days and passed through camps occupied by Asian workers where cholera had already broken out. Eric Stone of F Force wrote, "Leave at night. Weather terrible. Track nothing but mud. Cannot see. Boys tired. This is murder. Help one another along." Conditions. Accommodation. On arrival at their work sites, most workers found dilapidated or unfinished bamboo and atap huts. Others carried worn-out tents with them. Often they were not given time to repair or finish this accommodation before being driven out to work on road or rail. Whatever the accommodation, tattered tents or leaking atop, the men were packed together like sardines. 28 men under a tent fly, which normally covered 8. The sleeping platforms added to the distress of all. These were made of split bamboo fixed to bamboo frames. Not only were these platforms torture to emaciated bodies, but also soon became infested with blood-sucking lice and other biting insects. So even the chance of a restful sleep was denied the exhausted laborers. Mosquitoes from above, lice from below, and all night the demands of dysentery, making distressed men stumble and crawl their way to and from the latrines. Ray Parkin of Dunlop Force wrote, "The camp is a quagmire, mud on everybody and everything. In the tents, on the bamboo bedboards, splashed up our legs, and taken to bed with us." Of workers, food. The single factor that had the greatest impact on the health of those who worked on the railway was the food. Not only the quantity of food, but also its composition and quality. If the following ration scale from Japanese sources had been provided, the Asian workers may have managed, but the POWs would have suffered badly. Since this diet of little more than 2,000 calories per day was only half of what was required for men doing hard physical work. This chart shows the food rations for Japanese, POWs, and Romosha. It includes the figures for rice, grams per day, vegetables, meat, salt, tea, condiments, and sugar. In reality, the food that did reach many of the camps was often much less than this and of poor quality, much of it being pilfered en route. Rice, the staple food, was often broken grain, contaminated with foreign matter, for example, lime or kerosene. The Allies had attempted to destroy their rice stalks before surrender. Dirt, rat droppings, and weevils. Any meat or fish that did reach the camps was in tiny quantities and often rotten and full of maggots. So bad sometimes that it was condemned by the Japanese camp administration and was buried, only to be recovered later by the prisoners and cooked, the maggots being skimmed off the top of the stew before it was served. Of even greater impact was the small quantity of food supplied was its almost total lack of essential vitamins and minerals. It was this lack of vitamins and minerals that made the entire slave laborer force suffer and die from illnesses such as beriberi and pellagra, and to weaken their resistance to the numerous tropical diseases, which are endemic, even today, in the area around the railway: dysentery, tropical ulcers, and malaria. Here are a few items recovered from prisoner of war campsites. Here are more items recovered from prisoner of war campsites. Chances of survival. The conditions in any camp and consequent chances of survival were dependent on many factors. These could be natural or man-made and included whether the camp was in a healthy location, whether it had a good, clean water supply, whether it had easy access to food supplies, whether it was close to the railway construction site, what work the men were forced to perform, and whether the camp had an effective administration, both Japanese and POW. 2 H-Force camps reflect the effect natural conditions had on the death toll. Malay Hamlet, situated in a swampy area and drawing its water supply from a muddy, polluted stream, suffered 217 deaths from 745 men in 3 months. Tonchan Spring Camp was established close to a large natural spring, and only 29 of its 600 inmates died. 2 F-Force camps largely reflect the effect of man-made conditions. Shimo Songrai, populated by men who were initially in reasonable physical condition and who carried out normal railway and road construction tasks, had strong medical and camp leadership. This camp suffered 151 deaths from its 1,600 men. The nearby camp at Songkurai had a similar number of men, but men drawn largely from the hospitals of Changi. These men were forced to build a bridge across a large, fast-flowing stream. The leadership of this camp was ineffective and uncaring of the welfare of the men. 600 men died in the camp itself, and another 600 died after transfer to a hospital camp. Railway. Initially, the railway construction timetable allowed reasonable working conditions to be imposed on the prisoners of war who, at that time, formed the majority of the workforce. This, combined with the fact that the work was being done during the dry season of 1942-1943, meant that few deaths occurred during the first 8 months of the construction period. Deaths, July 1942 to February 1943. Americans, 0. Australians, 27. Dutch, 136. British, 255. Speedo! In March 1943, when the Japanese High Command ordered the rapid completion of the railway, soon to be known as the Speedo period, working conditions became much worse. Larger work quotas, longer working hours, and increasing brutality became normal. The inadequate diet, which had just been sustaining the men, no longer proved sufficient, and the physical condition of the men began to deteriorate. But still, the death rate remained moderately low. Deaths, March to May 1943. Americans, 4. Australians, 148. Dutch, 418. British, 430. With the advent of the wet season of 1943, the real tragedy of the Thailand-Burma Railway occurred. Diseases thrived in the conditions created by a tropical wet season, and the effect on men already weakened by meager, unsuitable rations and brutal work was devastating. They fell victim to diseases that would not usually prove fatal, if reasonable accommodation, adequate food, and medicines, and time to recuperate had been provided by the Japanese. Deaths, June to October 1943. Americans, 88. Australians, 1,630. Dutch, 1,303. British, 4,283. The next information board, respect for the dead. When compared to their total disregard for the living, POWs, and Asian Romusha, indeed, extreme callousness and cruelty, the Japanese displayed a perverse respect for the POW dead. In particular, they allowed the POWs to hold funerals and bury their dead in marked graves. During the early stages of the railway construction project, the Japanese often attended these funerals. Writing of the period at Victoria Point, Les Hall records, "We had already suffered 2 deaths from dysentery. The Japanese attended these funerals, laid wreaths, lit candles, provided a Japanese guard of honor, and donated $10 for additional mourning." The POWs were able to take advantage of the situation and that of Japanese fear of disturbing the dead by burying records in the graves of a number of POWs. The War Graves Search Party recovered many of these records in the graves in October 1945. War Graves personnel search a POW cemetery, September 1945. Entry for Tuesday, 25th September 1945, in the diary of Padre H. C. Babb, a member of the Allied War Graves Party searching for the graves of those who died during the construction of the Death Railway. 3 Nips were digging up the grave of Private D. A. Isles, TX 4217, who was buried 5th May 1943. Here they were seeking Brigadier Varley's and other Australian records. The cemetery clearing was completed at 0850 hours, and a few minutes later the metal box, 20 inches by 12 inches by 12 inches, was struck, and the box was out of the grave at 0900 hours. Captain White smiles. "The box seems to be in good condition, and we hope the records look as perfect as the outside of the box." Records recovered from the grave of an Australian POW. The next information board, the end of torment. Photographs of a POW service. A single grave. A large cemetery. Entranceways to other cemeteries, and a burial service. The human cost. Each railway spike represents 500 deaths. From Malaya, Tamils, Malays, and Chinese. Burmese. British POWs. Javanese. Australian POWs. Dutch POWs. Chinese from Singapore. American POWs. Amanese, which from French Indochina. Japanese and Koreans. A painting titled Our Glorious Death. A series of sketches by prisoners. A camp. Graves and Japanese guard supervision. Twists and turns of a section of a railway with graves marked along it. A trestle bridge under construction. A campsite along the railway. Brutal abuse by Japanese guards during the construction. Brutality. The fact that extreme brutality occurred on the railway is well documented. The files of the War Crimes Tribunals describe many cases. What are less well documented are the reasons and causes of this brutality. The engineers were professional, mainly educated soldiers who would tolerate no interference to their building of the railway. During the early months of railway construction, there was little pressure on the engineers from higher command, so they, as a group, applied little pressure on the labor force. Individuals did carry out acts of brutality, but these were largely just this: single acts carried out by individuals. These reasons could be one of many: disobeying or misunderstanding an order, breaking the Japanese imposed rules, the particular Japanese suffering loss of face for whatever reason, or simply that he was in a bad mood. As the pressure on the engineers to complete increased, there was a corresponding increase in the brutality inflicted on the workforce. Much of this brutality was of a group nature, the engineers collectively forcing the entire workforce to greater levels of productivity. It is important to understand that no nation uses its most intelligent and best troops to guard prisoners. In the case of the railway, many of the guards were Japanese considered unsuitable or unworthy of combat, or Koreans drafted into the Japanese army as auxiliaries. With much of the discipline within the Japanese army being maintained by physical punishment, any rank could inflict corporal punishment on a lower rank, and with the Koreans at the bottom of the ladder, it is not surprising that many Koreans took out their frustrations and rage on the POWs and Asian workers. Adding to the fear of possible brutality was the unpredictability and inconsistency of the Japanese and Koreans. Behavior that could elicit no response one moment could result in a terrible beating the next. Caution: graphic hospital scenes inside. This medical hut was constructed using funds generously donated by Mr. D. Crossley Cook and is dedicated to the memory of his father, Flying Officer Kenneth Crossley Cook of No. 62 Squadron, Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve, who died opposing the Japanese invasion of Malaya at Alo Star on 8th December 1941. The medical hut. More of the injury of the patient in the medical hut. The next information board: doctors, disease, and despair. The ulcer ward just stank of rotting flesh, a stink that made the insides crawl. The bandages were filthy, and the matter oozing from the gaping wounds. The images of a 5-day-old tropical ulcer. In the beriberi and deficiency wards, there were some pitiful sights. Some of the patients were so thin that they were skin and bone. Those with beriberi were looking fat, and it made them look like bloated toads. This image is of a POW with beriberi, indiced oidina. Writing of a party of Dutch prisoners of war who arrived in Tha Kanun from upriver on 12th July 1943, Dr. Robert Hardy records, the whole party were just living skeletons, collapsed and exhausted, made a ghastly picture, bearded, filthy, those who could stand staggering with matchstick legs and wasted faces, their eyes glazed with anguish and despair. No protest to the Japanese authorities against this inhuman treatment of the sick and the barbarous brutalities being inflicted by the engineers and guards on the railway workers seems to have any effect. This is a Dutch prisoner suffering from general debility. Corporal Harvey, 2nd of the 26th Battalion, suffering from beriberi. The true heroes of the Thailand-Burma Railway were the medical officers and medical orderlies. Not only did medical officers have to fight terrible diseases in appalling conditions with almost no equipment and medicines, they also had to fight the disinterest, callousness, and brutality of the Japanese. Often this brutality was directed against the medical officers themselves, when they attempted to protect their patients from the ruthlessness of the Japanese engineers or the ignorance of the Japanese POW administration. Had the Japanese fully realized the extent of the subtle tricks played by the doctors, even more of the doctors would have been beaten. Men who deserved the highest praise were those who acted as medical orderlies. Some of these were members of the various army medical units, but the majority were ordinary soldiers who offered to care for their sick and dying comrades at great risk from contracting and dying from the very same diseases. This was courage of the very greatest order, facing the possibility of death day after day whilst caring for others. The only way of adequately describing the appalling Japanese treatment of their laborers is to quote from diaries of men who were there. Major A. E. Saggers, the second command of Malay Hamlet, wrote, "Men taken from hospital were lined up with the others. Many would break down and cry. Others would vomit, while others would defecate from nervousness and or illness. Others sat in the mud in the ranks, awaiting the order to move, pitifully conserving their strength. The faces of all appeared haggard and drawn, and it was perfectly apparent that all were suffering from extreme exhaustion, lack of sleep, and undernourishment." 3 Australians considered fit for railway work. There were many factors that led to the appalling death toll on the railway. These included the inadequate diet, which led to a serious decline in the physical condition of the people forced to work on the railway, the inadequate supply of drugs and other medical supplies issued by the Japanese, the practice of not issuing rations for the sick, and the belief that this would encourage the sick to return to work, the complete disregard for providing reasonable shelter and hygienic conditions for the workforce, the utter callousness of the Japanese engineers in driving men to the point of death in their quest to complete the railway. Here's British POW showing effects of malnutrition. This is a display of a POW mannequin on a treatment bed. This thorny bamboo inflicted many wounds, causing tropical ulcers. Doctors, however, utilized the hollow thorns as needles for use in saline transfusion procedures. A man to be respected by all. After the hectic days leading up to the surrender of Java, Major Moon was recommended for an award for the work he carried out there. Lieutenant Colonel E. E. Dunlop, OC No. 1 AGH Bandion, wrote, "For exceptionally distinguished service and exemplary devotion to duty during and after the campaign in Java. His most expert and devoted work was responsible for the recovery of many severely wounded soldiers. In recognition for his devotion to duty and skills he displayed as a medical officer during his years of captivity, Major Moon was appointed a member of the Order of the British Empire, MBE. Brigadier A.S. Blackburn, GOC AIF, Java. Throughout the whole period of imprisonment in Thailand in 1943 to 1945, this officer, in squalid jails, prison camps, construction camps, and base hospitals, showed a radiant confidence, devotion to sick and dying POWs, and courage which inspired all who came into contact with him. A symbol of respect, the swagger stick. Major Alexander Moon, who had previously served in the Middle East with 2nd of the 2nd Casualty Clearing Section, was captured on Java in March 1942, when the Netherlands East Indies were surrendered to the Japanese. In January 1943, he was sent to Thailand as one of 4 medical officers with the 1,200 men of Dunlop Force. After a short period at Can Yu River Camp, he moved to Hintok Mountain Camp in April, where he worked as an assistant to Weary Dunlop. In May 1943, the Japanese established a large hospital at Tha Mar Kham under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Philip Toosey, Royal Artillery. Knowing of Major Moon's abilities, the Japanese selected him to be the senior medical officer of this hospital. As a further sign of the respect in which they held Major Moon, the Japanese allowed him to have made and to carry a swagger stick. This symbol of an officer's authority was denied other prisoner of war officers. Unknown to the Japanese, Major Moon enlisted the help of 4 gifted artists to create one of the most comprehensive records of Far East prisoner of war camp conditions and atrocities. He buried these records at the Tha Muang camp and recovered them after the Japanese surrender in August 1945. Major Moon giving instructions to orderlies for the treatment of a patient. In appreciation of the Australian medical personnel who gave so much for their fellow prisoners of war on the Thailand-Burma Railway, 1942 to 1945, their names are listed. Plus, the 6 identified Australian dentists, and they are listed. And the estimated 450 medical orderlies and volunteers who cared for the sick and suffering. Also, the chaplains for their work giving spiritual comfort to the men. This honor board, presented by the Defence Reserves Association of Western Australia, Remembrance Day Trip 2006. Captain John Barrett was taken prisoner in Singapore. He came to Thailand as a member of the advance party to the railway in June 1942. In November 1944, in intense pain from a twisted bowel, he was operated on without anesthetic by Dr. Major Alan Hobbs. He lived to tell the tale. John Barrett and Dr. Hobbs met in 1977, 37 years after the operation. John lived a very normal and happy life in Norfolk, England, until dying at the age of 89 years. His sons, David and Charlie, have donated this portrait of their father, drawn in June 1940 before leaving England, to the TBRC. In grateful thanks to this great Australian doctor, Major Alan Hobbs, for without him they would not have been born. The next information board, medical improvisation. Despite Japanese assurances that adequate medical supplies would be provided in Thailand and Burma, almost every piece of medical equipment used in the camps came with the POWs from Singapore or Java. Because most groups had to march to their work areas, preference was given to carrying essential medicines and important smaller items such as doctors' personal operating sets. Only in base hospitals such as Chung Kai did some larger items, an example, collapsible metal operating tables, microscopes, etc., exist. This forced the medical personnel to improvise and make even the most basic and essential equipment. Bamboo was used to make water containers, crutches, artificial legs, instrument containers, and bedpans. Stills made of petrol cans and fuel lines stolen from abandoned Japanese trucks produced distilled water for saline solution, which was then dispensed through old beer bottles and stethoscope tubing. In one hospital, a stolen bicycle was turned into a centrifuge to produce blood plasma. Improvised artificial legs and rehabilitation equipment. This plate was donated to the Thailand-Burma Railway Center by John Wagstaff in memory of his father, Lieutenant Charles Wagstaff. Cutting track bed through rock, a crayon cry. An information board describing the outdoor display that includes an original wartime telephone pole, original wartime boxcar, large bomb fragment, original rails set on wartime sleepers, and a 1:4 scale model trestle bridge. The telephone pole, the bomb fragment, the boxcar, and the trestle bridge model. The model bridge you are looking at has been built in memory of 2nd of the 18th Battalion, Australian Imperial Force, who, along with 12,000 other Australians, were transported to Thailand and Burma to work on the Thailand-Burma Railway. The track of the railway. The railway in use. There are many factors to take into account when discussing the effectiveness of the Thailand-Burma Railway during its 22 months of wartime operation. The actual design of the railway. This includes gradients, tightness of curves, and the location and number of passing facilities. The construction of the railway, strength of bridges, sturdiness of track bed, and trueness of rails themselves. The rolling stock used on the railway, the age and performance of the locomotives, the braking power of trains, and the coupling systems used to join wagons. Damage and disruption caused by Allied bombing. The changing strategic position of the Japanese army in Burma during this period. The operations conducted by the Japanese in Burma and the supplies required to maintain these operations determine what was transported along the railway. The other factors determined how quickly and effectively these supplies were moved. November 1943 to March 1944. The Japanese were preparing for their offensive into India. 53,200 tons of food, ammunition, and ordnance. 2 complete divisions of troops and their equipment were also transported to Burma. April 1944 to July 1944. The Japanese launched and maintained their attack on Kohima and Imphal. 49,950 tons of military supplies, 1/3 of this being fuel and oil. Another full division of troops. August 1944 to January 1945. The British forces defeat the Japanese attack and go onto the offensive. The Japanese strongly defend the central plains of Burma. 108,300 tons of supplies, most being ammunition and fuel for more open mechanized warfare of the central plains. No troop reinforcements. February 1945 to August 1945. The Japanese army defeated and in full retreat. 17,300 tons of supplies transported. More than 10,000 tons being food and less than 3,000 tons of ammunition. The main use of the railway during this period was for the evacuation of the Japanese army. A chart showing the operating sections of the railway. A legend explaining the different aspects of the chart. A water tower and a railway crossing. It was the intention of the Japanese to operate the railway using equipment transported from Japan. However, the destruction of shipping by Allied submarines made them take rolling stock and construction materials from areas captured during the invasion of Southeast Asia. The locomotives taken by the Japanese were all designed to use wood as fuel and were less powerful than coal-burning Japanese locomotives. In the railway operating diagram, these older locomotives were allocated to the flatter sections of the railway, and the Japanese built C-56s to the mountainous areas. Evidence of the selective use of locomotives can be found along the railway route between Tampi and Kanchanaburi. This is the only section of the railway where coal has so far been found, scattered around ash piles at the site of a coal dump at Kanchanaburi Station. Japanese locomotive drivers have confirmed the use of coal as a supplementary fuel. The Japanese also used large numbers of rail trucks. These were diesel trucks that could have the road wheels replaced with flanged rail wheels. These trucks could pull 4 wagons and were used during construction of the line and for transporting Japanese troops to Burma. As well as these heavy locomotives and trucks, the Japanese had approximately 60 motor trolleys of 4 different types. These could seat up to 12 people and were used for line inspections and the quick transport of repair crews. Another use for which the trolleys were put was the speedy transport of officers to and from Burma. A P-class locomotive used on the railway. A C-56 used on the railway. Wood being loaded for fuel on a locomotive on the railway. Coal found at Kanchanaburi Station for fuel for a Japanese locomotive. The Humanitas window and a guide explaining it. Legend for the Humanitas window. The Humanitas window is based on many accounts telling how this railway, which has been built to supply the Japanese army in Burma 22 months earlier, was then used to evacuate that defeated and starving army from Burma. The window was based on a specific incident which tells how, after 6 days coming over the mountains from Burma, the train broke down at Kanchanaburi. The Japanese injured were restricted to their wagons, which sat in the sun for 6 hours. The British, Australian, and Dutch POWs heard moans coming from the wagons and realized that there were injured Japanese inside crying out for water. The POWs, their years of suffering at the hands of the Japanese notwithstanding, tried to bring water to the injured. The Japanese officers and guards refused, saying the injured were not worthy of help because they had failed the emperor. The Japanese officers and guards threatened to shoot, but the POWs ignored them and started giving water to the injured Japanese soldiers. The window title, Humanitas, is repeated 4 times and the simple blue border. The artists carefully chose this Latin noun because it means human nature, civilization, and kindness. They wanted a title that described being human as ultimately being more important than nationality, politics, creed, color, or gender. 2. Texts from 5 different officers describing 5 similar events. These accounts inspired the artists to make the window. 3. This Thai woman and her daughter are at the center of the composition. They represent everyday family life. They are walking from one village to another. The woman has a look of disbelief on her face when she sees the miserable scene. Her innocent daughter, holding her mother with one hand and her doll with the other, has asked, "Mommy, what are they doing?" Excellent question. Out of the mouths of babes. 4. The empty bucket illustrates the inscription below it. 5. This illustrates the 3rd inscription. The journal bearing the engine's tender has seized. It has been removed and the mechanics have gone looking for a new part. This symbolizes the breakdown of regular maintenance and the failing military supply chain. 6. The reference material for the undercarriage of this wagon is the World War II wagon in the backyard of this museum. 7. An emaciated Dutch POW has brought water and is pouring it into the makeshift cups of the thirsty and neglected Japanese sick and wounded. 8. A badly wounded Japanese soldier gratefully receives the water. 9. Many Japanese hands are coming from inside the cattle wagon, holding out their cups. One only has cupped hands for water. While this was literally true, our artists intended it to be a metaphor for the soldiers also asking for the truth. Could they believe what they were being told by the military government, or were they being fed totally false propaganda? Was Japan winning the war? Was Japan really being bombed? What was really happening to their families in Japan? We should never forget Aeschylus, who lived from 525 to 546 BCE, the Greek dramatist, saying, "In war, truth is the first casualty." 10. Stretching towards each other in an incomplete arch, framing the top of the composition, a wounded Japanese soldier is holding out his improvised drinking vessel to an emaciated Australian POW, offering water from his bottle. The gesture is unmistakable, but the reality is, despite their mutual goodwill, they are not going to reach each other. This symbolizes the vast cultural differences between a militarized Japan and the democratic allies. 11. This face represents the calamity that has befallen Japan. This soldier may have been sent to Manchuria in mid-1930s, then to China, Taiwan, Thailand, Malaya, Singapore, and then to Burma. He may not have seen his family or homeland for 10 years. The thought that he has given his youth to a Japan that is impossibly losing the war, and that his homeland may even be occupied by the enemy, is dismaying. This landscape is based on the limestone hills seen from the railway line at Kanchanaburi. 13. In June 1942, Allied POWs destined to build the railway were packed into wagons for the 4-day journey from Singapore to Thailand. 3 years later, the Japanese, wounded and dying from the retreating Japanese army, were packed into the same wagons for the 5-day journey from Burma to Thailand. This reversal aroused the artist's imagination. 14. The beautiful semicircular flame tree replaces the Imperial Japanese Rising Sun flag and makes its own comment about nature and militarism. The arching giant bamboo, Dendrocalamus giganteus, artistically echoes the Japanese and Australian soldiers reaching out to each other below it. It is also a strong Thai image. 16. The monumental Japanese built water tower was built at Wang Fo to supply water to steam engines. It is still in use today as the town's water supply. 17. This etap and bamboo railway station was based on World War II photographs of the railway stations at Ban Pong and Konkoita. 18. A British POW is bringing buckets of water. 19. The rifle is an SMLE .303 captured from the intact British arsenal at the Fall of Singapore and still in use 5 years later. Its inclusion in the window is deliberately ironic, with the Japanese Guard using a British rifle to threaten Allied POWs. 20. The Japanese Guard has been told by the nearby officer to shoot the POWs if they give water to his comrades in the carriages, but he is confused by the situation. To emphasize his uncertainty, his rifle is held part way between firing and bayoneting positions. 21. The Japanese officer is likewise bewildered. He has ordered the POWs not to supply water to his own wounded soldiers has been disobeyed, and he is scowling. He has drawn his pistol, but is not in a firing position. 22. The water standpipe is designed to swing over the engine tender to rapidly fill it with water. There is plenty of water for the steam engine, but none for the wounded soldiers. The standpipe still exists at Wang Fo Railway Yard. 23. The failing military supply chain is evident everywhere in the window. All the uniforms are tattered. Some bandages are made of discarded uniforms. Metal is rusting, and there is an undetected crack in the wheel of the wagon. The end is nigh. 24. The pagoda flower, Orodendron pariculatum, with its distinctive shape, is native to Southeast Asia. The artist saw this plant near Hintok Cutting. It is symbolically overgrowing the damaged and now abandoned field gun. 25. The Japanese field gun, built under license from Krupp, was feared by the Allies. It could be dismantled and carried anywhere by soldiers. It is now ruined and overgrown by nature. Jerry Cummins and Joe Stain, 2016. Not just a railway system. After the completion of the railway construction project, almost all of the Allied POWs were evacuated from the jungle camps. They were sent to base camps in or close to Kanchanaburi and Don Pladuk, or, in the case of F and H forces, back to Singapore. Subsequently, small groups were randomly sent back to carry out maintenance or repairs and to cut timber for fuel. All normal railway operational tasks, servicing of locomotives and railway stock, loading and unloading of freight, and regular line maintenance, were carried out by the Japanese and large numbers of surviving Asian laborers. At the end of the war, more than 22,000 were still employed by the Japanese in Thailand alone. It is important to understand that the railway was designed and operated as a fully functional railway system under the control of the Japanese Army. This means that the railway was divided into operating sections: Non-Pladuk to Kanchanaburi, Kanchanaburi to Wang Pho, Wang Pho to Kinsayok, and so on as far as Mulmai. There were workshops and major facilities in each section. There were supplies and other facilities at intermediate stations. The locomotives were allocated to those sections most suited to their performance. The trains operated largely to a timetable. The next information section, titled The Record Keepers. The Record Keepers. During the years of captivity, most of the functions of military life continued. Some of those were obvious to all of the prisoners of war: parades and roll calls, selection for work parties, and other duties. What was far less obvious to those forced into the harsh routine of slaving for the Japanese was that men were quietly recording everything. Some of this was done on the orders of the Japanese, some was done independently with the knowledge of the Japanese, and still more was recorded secretly. Many of these records survived the war and are now held in archives around the world. It is from these original records that the originator of this museum gathered much of the information now on display. Perhaps the greatest of these record keepers was the New Zealander Captain David Nelson. He worked for the Singapore Improvement Trust from 1928 as a surveyor and civil engineer. During the Battle for Singapore, he was second in command of the Singapore Royal Engineers, volunteers. Soon after capture, Captain Nelson and several others realized the importance of recording the location, movement, and fate of the very large numbers of POWs moving throughout Southeast Asia. This work was originally done secretly, but later with the knowledge of the Japanese. The group was finally recognized as the Changi Bureau of Record and Inquiry, the BRE. Of greater importance to the POWs working on the railway was the work done by the BRE in assisting the Japanese with the complex task of sorting and redirecting the very large volume of mail sent by their families. Of the many factors affecting men's morale, the most important was information from their loved ones. The small diary on display records a little of life in Changi and some of the work done by the BRE. Another diary kept by Captain Nelson, on which his book, The Story of Changi, Singapore, was based, was lodged with the Imperial War Museum in London many years ago. The Pacific War reverses, and the Allies defeat the Japanese forces on all fronts and advance back into East and Southeast Asia. This map shows the Allies retaking most places that were lost. General Chiang Kai-shek inspecting troops. Americans landing on a Pacific island. Australian soldiers on patrol in New Guinea. Indian soldiers on patrol in Burma. British soldiers in Southeast Asia. Bombing the bridge. Once the Japanese knew that the Allies could bomb the railway, they realized that the 8 steel bridges would be prime targets to provide an alternative crossing of the Mai Klong River, later to be known as the River Kwai, the Japanese engineers rebuilt the wooden bridge, which had carried construction traffic across the river in 1943 prior to the completion of the steel bridge. The first air raid on the Kwai bridges was done by the USAAF's 9th and 493rd Squadrons on the 29th of November, 1944. This raid caused some damage to the steel bridge. Sadly, a bomb fell into the nearby POW camp, and a large number of men were killed or wounded. A second raid on 13th December also caused little damage. On 5th February, 4 squadrons carried out a large-scale raid that badly damaged the track leading to the bridges, but left the bridges intact. A further attack, only 4 days later, finally demolished 2 spans of the wooden bridge, but again left the steel bridge undamaged. Late in 1944, 493rd Squadron had been supplied with the new Azon bomb system. On 13 February, this squadron carried out its first attack on the Kwai bridges using this weapon. Finally, success was achieved, with 2 spans of the steel bridge being demolished and more damage done to the timber bridge. Within 6 weeks, the reconnaissance photographs showed the wooden bridge back in use, so a further attack was planned. This took place on 3rd April by 2 squadrons of the USAAF. Again, a section of the wooden bridge was damaged. The final raid on the bridges took place on 24th June 1945, when aircraft from 159th and 356th Squadrons of the Royal Air Force attacked the bridges, both of which had been repaired. This raid destroyed 3 spans of the steel bridge and breached the wooden bridge in 2 places. Bridges before bombing raids, bridges after the bombing raids. Bombing the railway. The only raids on the railway in 1943, before the monsoon brought an end to air operations for the rest of the year, were 2 small attacks on Tham Bu Zayat on 12th and 15th June. Unfortunately, 1 bomb of first attack fell on the camp well, just as a party of prisoners were drawing water, killing 12 men. Since the Japanese refused to identify POW camps, the huts for prisoners were indistinguishable from Japanese barracks or warehouses, and so the second raid was directed against the POW camp itself. This time, 17 died and more than 40 were wounded. Early in 1944, the Japanese began their attack on India, so the Allies concentrated their attack on the Japanese communication system within Burma. Rangoon, Mandalay, and Pegu were much closer to the Allied bases, and damage here had the same effect on Japanese supply lines as damage caused further afield. To Allied command, the railway was just another part of the Japanese communications network, and air attacks against it were planned accordingly, as a part of a regional bombing campaign. Despite the damage done to the railway by Allied bombing during 1944, the tonnage carried along it continued to rise until November, when more than 20,000 tons of supplies were transported to Burma. It was not until early 1945 that major disruption of the railway occurred. This was after the USAAF introduced 2 new bombing techniques. The first was a simple dive bombing technique whereby the pilot lined up a row of rivets on the nose of his aircraft with a target and then dropped the bombs. The second was the deployment of the newly developed guided bombs. Bomb attack on the bridges at Tha Makam, Thailand. An unfortunate result of the bombing campaign was the death of several hundred POWs when bombs were dropped into camps. The worst event being at Nong Pladuk on 7th September 1944, when almost 100 men were killed and more than 300 wounded. The bridge on the River Kwai, destroyed by Allied bombing. The final raid. On 24th June 1945, 26 India-based Royal Air Force B-24 Liberators from 159, 355, and 356 squadrons attacked the two railway bridges at Tha Makham, near Kanchanaburi, Siam. RCAF Flight Lieutenant Roy M. Borthwick, a 24-year-old pilot from Vancouver, BC, skippered the 159 Squadron Liberator KH-398 on the operation. Flight Lieutenant Borthwick made 5 passes unscathed, each time approaching from 1,000 feet, descending to 500 feet, and dropping a single 1,000-pound bomb, and then dropping lower and hugging the ground to avoid anti-aircraft fire, while his gunners fired back at Japanese ack-ack positions and railway targets of opportunity. Early in the raid, a bomb from Flight Lieutenant Borthwick's aircraft scored a direct hit on the steel and concrete bridge. This was followed by another direct hit by Liberator EW-173, skippered by New Zealand Flight Officer Johnny Haycock. In all, 3 spans of the main bridge were destroyed. The focus then turned to the wooden bypass bridge, where 2 gaps were blown. While the steel bridge was not repaired until post-war, POWs were forced to repair the wooden bridge, which remained in use until 1947. RCAF Flight Lieutenant Borthwick, J21490, and his bomb aimer, RCF Flight Officer William Drew, J44132, were each awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for cool judgment, courage, and great devotion to duty. The other crewmen of KH-398 were Flight Officer C.F. Nesbitt, Flight Officer E.R. Kennedy, Sergeant R. Meredith, Flight Sergeant E. Johnson, Sergeant W.M. Ross, Sergeant J. Knotts, and Sergeant J.S. Blythe. Azon, the first of the guided bombs. As with most military powers, the United States had weapon research programs running prior to its entry into World War II. One of the subjects being studied was the guidance of bombs. The early work included television, radar, heat-seeking, radio, and photoelectric guidance. During 1942, a decision was reached to concentrate most effort on the radio control program. Azon, azimuth only, was the result. This was a bomb that could be steered to the right or left by the bombardier or of the airplane that had dropped the bomb. Potentially, this made the bombs effective against long, straight targets, such as railways or bridges, where an accurate estimate of range was not required. After solving a large number of technical problems, including bomb stabilization, unsuitable batteries, flare failure, and radio receiver faults, the first Azons were ready for testing. The first large-scale test of 16 bombs resulted in average target error of 42 feet. 8 standard bombs dropped simultaneously missed their targets by an average of 1,215 feet. The major obstacle to the use of the Azon was that the airplane dropping the bomb had to fly straight and level until the bomb reached the target. Because the Germans had good defenses against Allied bombers, the Azons were only used briefly in the European theater before being withdrawn from service. The first Azon-equipped B-24 Liberator bombers arrived in India to join the USAAF's 7th Bombardment Group 493rd Squadron on September 1944. After training, the first mission using Azon bombs was against the 300-foot-long railway bridge at Kanchanaburi, Burma, on 27th December. Many attacks during the previous year had failed to destroy this bridge. The first Azon attack resulted in 4 direct hits, which destroyed the bridge. The following table, taken from the records of the 493rd Squadron, shows how effective the newly developed weapon proved to be when used against suitable targets, and when there was no enemy threat to the attacking bombers. Bridges attacked: Azon 36, Standard 19. Bombs dropped: Azon 413, Standard 438. Bridges destroyed: Azon 23, Standard 3. Bridges damaged: Azon 3, Standard 0. Fragments of an Azon bomb. Railway track destroyed by bomb blast, found north of Hintok. Azon. The End of the War. Here is a copy of the Instrument of Surrender, signed by the Emperor Hirohito, General MacArthur, and representatives of many Allied countries on September 2nd, 1945, on the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The Surrender Ceremony in Singapore, 12th September, 1945. More of the Japanese surrender in Singapore, 12th September, 1945. The instrument of surrender signed in Singapore by the Japanese commanders Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten and representatives of several Allied countries. How do we know? In common with most aspects of the railway, there are two potential sources of information regarding the actual operation of the railway. Records kept by the Japanese. Most of these were destroyed after the surrender and before the Allied Liberation Forces arrived in early September 1945. Records kept by the POWs. In this case, little could be recorded because POWs were not involved with the railway after its completion, other than as members of repair, maintenance, and woodcutting parties. For history's sake, it is fortunate that on the day after the Japanese surrender, a senior Dutch officer, Lieutenant Colonel K.A. Wormenhoven, marched into the railway control center in Kanchanaburi and told the Japanese that from that moment he was taking control of the railway. Allied High Command subsequently confirmed this action, and Lieutenant Colonel Wormenhoven remained in command of the railway until the British disposed of it in 1947. Prior to the war, Lieutenant Colonel Wormenhoven had been a railway engineer in the Netherlands East Indies, so he had an affinity for railways, which transcended his personal feelings about the Japanese. During the 2 years he was in charge of the railway and of the Japanese who had built and operated it, Lieutenant Colonel Wormenhoven obtained a large amount of information about many aspects of the railway. This information was written into an extensive and detailed report in 1947. This report, one of the most significant written about the railway, was uncovered in London in February 1999 by the creator of this museum. How did they know? Secret radios. Many POWs were able to get up-to-date information about the progress of the war through the many secret radios. A large number of Army and Air Force signalers and technicians, many being qualified radio personnel, were held within the prisoner ranks. Using materials obtained from every possible source, stolen from the Japanese, scrounged during the cleanup of Singapore, or improvised from bits and pieces, these men made radios to fit secretly within various everyday articles, such as water bottles, broom heads, and furniture. There were two serious problems associated with these radios, often referred to as canaries. Firstly, there was the difficulty of obtaining birdseed, as the batteries are called, to keep the radios working. Secondly, and of greater concern, was the possible discovery of the radios by the Japanese. There was only one penalty for being in possession of a radio: death. When a radio was found during a Kimpitai, Japanese secret military police search in Kanchanaburi in 1943, 2 British officers were beaten to death. There's a scene staged in Singapore after Japanese surrender with 2 POWs demonstrating one of the many secret POW radios. With the radio is QX6461 Lieutenant Robert Kelsey from Queensland, who was a lookout for the radio operators in his camp. The interested observer is NX35617 driver Wally Fackender from New South Wales. The Asian workforce. A closer look at the first section of the information board, Kra Isthmus Railway. Kra Isthmus Railway. In June 1943, construction started on a railway to run from Champhon on the east coast of the Kra Isthmus, 90 kilometers to Ban Khao Pha Chi, near the mouth of the Kra River, on the west coast. This railway was to allow the Japanese to supply troops in southern Burma by rail and coastal shipping rather than the long and dangerous sea route via Singapore. Under an agreement between the Thai and Japanese governments, Thailand agreed to prepare the earthworks and build bridges for the railway. The Japanese supplied rail track stolen from Malaya and the technical staff to operate the railway. Thai contractors had great difficulty in retaining their labor, so the Japanese obtained labor, voluntarily or otherwise, from Malaya. With all formal documents destroyed, it can only be estimated that between 60,000 and 120,000 laborers were drafted from Malaya. The railway was completed by November 1943 and operated until Allied bombing raids caused such severe damage that it was abandoned in March 1945. With no doctors or medicines available to the Ramosha, the death toll was even higher than for their comrades forced to work on the Thailand-Burma Railway. It's a railway cutting near Kanchanaburi. It's looking to Burma across the Kra River. Railway Bridge Pier. Relics of the railway. The Forgotten Asians. Asian Ramusha made up 80% of the labor force on the Thailand-Burma Railway and the whole workforce on the Kra Isthmus Railway. The greatest difference in the way the Asians were treated by the Japanese as compared to the Allied POWs was that the Asians were directly controlled by the railway engineers. Engineers whose only aim was to complete the railway in the time laid down, regardless of the suffering of those building the railway. Little to no interest was shown in the welfare of these unfortunate enough to be sent to the railway projects. Not a single record exists of the thousands who died, nor a single memorial until 2023 here in Kanchanaburi. Andrew Gilchrist of the British Force 136 was sent to investigate the Kra Isthmus Railway post-war and reported the hospital as being a charnel house of despair and death. Thailand-Burma Railway. The early work on the railway was carried out mainly by Allied prisoners of war. The situation changed in February 1943 with the Japanese decision to complete the railway months earlier than originally planned. With the pool of Allied POWs almost exhausted, the only way the Japanese could finish the railway by the new deadline was to employ huge numbers of Asian laborers. On the railway, there were two different Asian workforces. In Burma, the pro-Japanese Burmese administration recruited local labor. Because Thailand remained independent, the Japanese could not force Thai people to work for them. However, the first section of the railway from Dong Pladuk to Kanchanaburi was built under contract using local labor. In Burma, when it became known how terrible the conditions were on the railway project, it became necessary for the recruiters to use more forceful means to supply the labor demanded by the Japanese. Eventually, approximately 90,000 Burmese worked on the railway. To provide the required labor for the Thailand side of the railway, the Japanese turned to the large pool of unemployed Tamil Indians who had previously worked on the rubber estates in Malaya. Approximately 75,000 of these men, along with many other families, were sent to Thailand. Smaller numbers of Chinese from Singapore and Javanese from the Netherlands, East Indies, were also sent. Here are Asian laborers working on a trestle bridge. Asian workers laying track on a flat part of the railway. When your time is up. Marius Vos was born on 17th May 1915 in Gouda, the Netherlands. He graduated from the Royal Military Academy as a lieutenant in 1935. He was posted to the Netherlands East Indies in 1936. While Marius was working on the Thailand-Burma Railway, his wife and children were held in Japanese internment camps in Java. Fortunately, all survived and were reunited in December 1945. After the Japanese surrender in August 1945, Marius saw a Japanese officer wearing a watch and having had all of his possessions stolen by the Japanese during captivity, gained a little back when he told the Japanese that, "Your time is up, so you will not need the watch anymore," and took the watch. Marius Vos passed away in November 1999, aged 84. The wider impact on families in the Dutch East Indies during World War II. Personal story by a grandson whose family had become prisoners of war with all other Dutch Indonesians. 1942. Following the Japanese occupation of the Dutch East Indies, military prisoners of war, POWs, were taken to build the 415-kilometer rail link between Thailand and Burma, the Siam-Burma Railway, alongside many more Asian laborers. Mr. Robert Volkert was a KNIL soldier and one of many who ended up on this railway in Thailand, an experience he shared with other members of his family. At the same time, Ms. Maria Carolina van Swieten was among the many Dutch Indonesian women and children also imprisoned by the Japanese in civilian prison camps in Java, Indonesia. 1945. On 15th August 1945, Japan surrendered to end the Second World War, and 2 days later, on 17th August 1945, Indonesia declared independence from the Netherlands. However, 4 difficult years were to follow. 1948, Mr. Volkert managed to survive his time on the railway and subsequent transfer to POW labor camps in Japan, and Ms. Maria Carolina van Swieten was released from camp in Indonesia. Robert and Maria met each other in Malang, Java, via a cousin of Robert in 1948. In December 1949, sovereignty of the country was officially transferred from the Netherlands to Indonesia. 1957, Robert Volkert and Maria Carolina van Swieten, now married, wished to remain Dutch citizens and decided to move to the Netherlands with their children, Rita, Joyce, Sylvia, and Peter. Their journey from Indonesia to Amsterdam on the Dutch ship MS Johan van Oldenbarneveld took them 4 weeks. 1967. Robert Volkert worked for Philips Electronics until he passed away in 1967 due to a stroke that may well have been related to the severe conditions, ill treatment, and cruelties he endured working on the Siam-Burma Railway. It's not uncommon for victims to never speak out of the things they experienced, simply because people who haven't endured these atrocities would never understand them. Therefore, we must remember them. Presented to Thailand-Burma Railway Center by Robert Volkert's grandson, Pim van Melk, to help ensure this history is not forgotten. Help to the POWs. Even though local people were sympathetic to the plight of the POWs, there was little they could do other than to give token help in the form of food or perhaps small quantities of medicine. There were, however, several sources of assistance to the camps on the southern part of the railway, the most important being that set up by 2 Bangkok-based businessmen, Mr. K.C. Gardiner of Siam Imports Architects Company and Mr. E.P. Heath of the Borneo Company. From their internment camp in Bangkok, they were able to obtain money and goods and exchange messages with the help of Gardner's wife, Millie, and a Chinese employee, K.S. Hong. This organization made contact with the POWs in Nong Pladuk in September 1942 by passing a note signed V to a Lance Corporal Peyton. Once contact was established, this V organization supplied large amounts of money and drugs to the POWs. In December 1942, Peter Heath and colleague Dick Hempson of Anglo-Siam Corporation established a more ambitious aid network to provide help to a greater number of camps. They continued to use the code V for this new assistance, valued at more than 300,000 taikals, 30,000 taikals being donated by various people and the remainder borrowed against IOUs guaranteeing repayment in sterling. A number of local businessmen, including Nai Boon Pang and Nai Lee Sun, displayed remarkable courage in providing aid to the POWs. As a canteen contractor to the Japanese, they were able to visit many of the camps as far upcountry as Tha Kanun. Not only did Nai Boon Pong and Nai Lee Sun supply aid from their own resources, but they were also a conduit for the aid coming from Bangkok, from V. Remembering the Dead. The principle on which this museum was designed and built was to provide a truthful account of the construction and use of the Burma-Thailand Railway and to honor those who suffered as a result. The suffering continues to this day, not only by the men who slaved on the railway, but also by their families. One of the greatest failures by the authorities of all nations was to provide information to the families of those who died as the true circumstances of these men's death. Even now, more than 60 years later, which is 80 years now, many families have no idea what happened to a relative. One of the main research efforts by the curator of this museum has been to research the fate of every Allied prisoner of war who died as a result of being sent to work on the Thailand-Burma Railway. The results of this research are now available on request. Their spirit lives on and will do so forever, because no man gave his life in vain. Their bodies may lie in a far-off field, but their spirits live today, perhaps in new bodies, to inspire and help those youthful ones among us now. Leo Rawlings. And the dawn came up like thunder. Who worked on the Thailand-Burma Railway during World War II? At the outbreak of World War II, the 2nd Battalion of the Worcestershire Regiment was stationed at Rawalpindi, and during the early months of the war was posted to the northwest frontier of India. Later, the unit took part in the battles in Burma, and Colour Sergeant Lane and several members of the unit were seconded to other units posted to Singapore and became prisoners of war when Singapore surrendered to the Japanese on 15th February 1942. Colour Sergeant Lane was sent to Thailand with F Force in April 1943 and worked at the Songkhurai area before falling ill. He was transferred to Thambaya Hospital Camp in Burma in August and died there of dysentery on 6th September. After the war, his remains and those of others buried in the camp burial grounds were exhumed and reburied in Thambu Zayat War Cemetery, grave number B1E3. These medals have been kindly donated to this museum from the personal collection of Mr. Akichi Chikongoin. In memory of 15th Platoon, C Company, 2nd of the 26th Battalion, 8th Division, Australian Imperial Force. The infantry unit was part of the Australian force which defended southern Malaya in 1941. After withdrawal into Singapore Island at the end of January 1942, the 2nd of the 26th Battalion was one of the front-line units that opposed the Japanese landings on the northwest of the island. Along with all other Commonwealth forces on Singapore Island, the battalion surrendered to the Japanese on 15 February 1942. In common with many of the units captured by the Japanese, more men of the 15th Platoon died during 3.5 years of captivity than during the battle for Malaya and Singapore. Most dies of disease or illness, exacerbated by overwork, poor nutrition, and deplorable living conditions. The officer commanding this platoon, QX 6462 Lieutenant C.J.C. Wagstaff, had the names of his men inscribed onto a sheet of aluminum as a permanent record. This plate now serves as a memorial to one tiny group of the hundreds of thousands of men and women who suffered as prisoners of war during World War II. Here is C Company marching through Brisbane. This plate was donated to the Thailand-Burma Railway Centre by John Wagstaff in memory of his father, Lieutenant Charles Wagstaff. The list of the platoon members and what happened to them. In memory of Private Jeffrey Achilles Bolton, service number 1579061, RAOC 14 Section, British Army. Private Bolton was captured in Singapore and on 25th October 42 came to the Thailand-Burma Railway with letter party X. With Group 2, he was sent to Wang Tan Keng, Ban Kao, Tu Kai, Tha Ka Nun, and 203 Kilo. Then, on completion of the railway at the end of 1943, returned to Chung Kai. In early 1945, he was sent further south to Kachu Mountain for airfield construction. The airfield was ironically put to good use by the Allied forces in evacuating the former POWs for their repatriation home. Jeffrey returned home at the end of the war to become a lecturer in his former trade of gas fitting until his retirement in 1983. He sadly passed away 2 years later in 1985. His medals were placed in the care of this museum by Carl Bolton in honor of his father. Dear Terry, thank you for the recent email you sent referencing my father's medals. I really appreciate your suggestion and comments. I do have an appropriate picture of him in uniform, which, along with the medals, would give me the great satisfaction to donate them for display at TBRC. It is my belief, along with the comments I expressed to you before, that the best place for them would be in the area in which he died. The theater of war in the Far East is where he gave his life, and it would give me such solace to know they would be safe in your custody. From Bernard Gray Essen. 5833274, Private Percy Cecil Gray, died at Tonchan, south of Cholera, on 1st July 1943. Why would a grandfather join the army? For whatever reason, Arthur Thomas left his home and family in Redfern, Sydney, to enlist in the Australian Army. Perhaps because of his age, he was posted to an Army medical unit. The prisoner of war command at Changi tried to protect him from overseas Japanese work parties, but eventually he was sent to Thailand with F Force in April 1943. After falling sick in a work camp close to the Burma border, he was sent to Thanbaya Hospital Camp with 1,700 other desperately sick men in August 1943. Arthur was evacuated to Kanchanaburi F Force Hospital in December 1943, where he died of sickness on 23rd February 1944. The uniform that went home from the war without its owner. Displayed is the original officer's uniform of the Gordon Highlanders that belonged to Captain John Munro, who served his country in World War II, was taken prisoner of the Japanese at the fall of Singapore on 15 February 1942, and sent to work on the Thailand-Burma Railway on 27 October 1942 with letter party V. Captain Munro was part of the Japanese Group 2 on the railway in Thailand. Originally based at Chiang Kai and on the southern end of the line before being sent far north to the jungle camps around Tha Ka Noon. He was based at nearby Nam Chun Yai camp, where he sadly died from Wells disease at the age of 24. Uniform returned to Kanchanaburi. At the end of the war, in 1945, John Munro's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Stitt, who had generously taken possession of John Munro's uniform in Thailand, kindly returned it to John's mother in UK, where it was cleaned and kept. Captain Munro's nephew, also named John Munro, visited this museum in 2011 and subsequently learned more of his uncle's time as a POW. On his return to the UK, the uniform was located in his mother's attic, and the family very kindly donated it so that it could be displayed for the benefit of all. Captain John Gartside Munro, 77690, 2nd Battalion, the Gordon Highlanders, born 16 September 1918, captured Singapore 15 February 1942, sent to Thailand-Burma Railway on 27 October 1942 with letter party V, died at POW camp on 3 August 1943, now buried at Kanchanaburi Cemetery. 1 Plot 6, Row C, grave number 06. Highlander dress items belonging to Captain John Munro of the Gordon Highlanders, including belt braces, sporrans, and other items forming part of the Highland dress worn and used by him on civilian or ceremonial occasions. Kindly donated along with Captain Munro's uniform in October 2012. Officers of the Gordon Highlanders, pre-war. Captain John Munro, middle row, last on the right. Original POW diary and pen. This original diary was kept by Henry Edward Bill, a British private from the Cambridgeshire Regiment, from October 1941 to October 1945. During his captivity, generously donated to the Thailand-Burma Railway Centre by his son, Tim Bill. Special notice to those who wish to assist in our research. Diary of Henry Edward Bill. During his time as a POW from October 1941 to October 1945. Tim Bill, the son of Henry Edward Bill, has printed a small number of replicas of his father's diary for family and friends, and has generously donated a very limited number to the Thailand-Burma Railway Centre to assist in raising funds for its ongoing research. Due to the unique and significant nature of this item and the intention of its gift to the museum, we would like to offer a copy to those who wish to make a cash donation for ongoing research of 3,000 baht or above. A certificate of appreciation, together with a small dedication to Henry Edward Bill, will accompany the copy of the diary as a gesture of sincere appreciation from the Centre. More artifacts. 777807, Gunner Thomas Stone, Royal Artillery, born 6 September 1905. Father killed in World War I. Raised in an orphanage. Served in Army 1928 to 1931. Called up for Army service 1939. Sent to France with BEF. Rescued from Dunkirk May 1940. Sent to Malaya. Captured Singapore February 1942. Sent to Thailand 1942. Repatriated from Thailand 1945. Discharged from Army June 1946. Gunner Stone with dog, France, 1940. Items that Gunner Thomas Stone carried home have been kindly donated to the center by Conrad Stone as a dedication to his father. F Force survivor, 2597440, signalman Donald Purslow Roberts. Born in Roebourne, Wales, on 8 February 1921, Donald Purslow Roberts was a cost accounts clerk before joining the British Army in the Royal Corps of Signals. He was captured at the fall of Singapore on 15 February 1942 and remained there for 14 months until sent by train to Thailand on 24 April 1943 to work on the railway with the 7,000 men of F Force. Following a 4.5-day terrible train journey to Thailand, he then faced a 300-kilometer walk of over 17 days to his work area to the northwest of Thailand at Songkhrai, near the Burma border. He was one of more than 1,200 very sick men of this force sent 60 kilometers further north into Burma into August 1943 to the specially built hospital camp in Thanbaya. In November 43, he was evacuated to Kanchanaburi via the then completed railway to be returned to Singapore. Following the Japanese surrender in August 45, he was one of just 40% of the British in F Force to survive and return home. The memorabilia displayed here was faithfully preserved by his family and entrusted to this center in 2019 by Terry Pierce on behalf of the family. Men are remembered by their families in different ways, sometimes personally by the mementos they leave behind, sometimes as having been members of a famous military unit. Thailand-Burma Railway Center is honored to be able to play a part in remembering those who suffered on the railway. These medals honoring the service of Albert Bateman as a member of the Cambridgeshire Regiment of the British Army were donated by his son, John Bateman. Statue of General William Slim, commander of the British Army in Burma, 1944 to 1945. Statue of infantryman of the Cambridgeshire Regiment. This collection, dedicated to the memory of Private George Large, highlights the homesickness of a young soldier away from his family for the first time, riding from the ship he was sailing on to Singapore. He was asking for his family members to write, and the inability to get information as to his fate. He becomes a prisoner of war when Singapore capitulates on 15 February 1942. 30th March 1942, family receives a report that Private G.E. Large is missing. 27th May 1943, family receives a letter stating that Private G.E. Large is a POW. 4th June 1943, family receives a letter from the Red Cross regarding postal address. Family receives a letter card from number 1 POW camp in Thailand. 6th August 1943, Private G.E. Large dies of acute appendicitis in Prang Kasi, Thailand. 27th August 1943, authorities write to family saying they do not need to see the letter card received by the family. 12th January 1944, authorities write to family requesting to see the letter card for record purposes. Letter card sent to Thailand by family is returned as undeliverable. 12th April 1945, family receives a letter from the War Office stating that Private G.E. Large died about September 1943 in Thailand. The survivors from the sunken Japanese transport were interrogated in September 1944. 4th October 1945, the family of Private G.E. Large receives formal notification from the War Office of his death, more than 2 years previously. A memorial to 5950136 Private George Edward Large, 5th Battalion, Bedfordshire and Hertfordshire Regiment, is located in the Memorial Garden in front of the museum. A better look at the full display case. Search for the dead. As the newly released POWs were being repatriated to Bangkok or Singapore, they were debriefed and any records they held were collected. Early in September 1945, members of the Australian, British, and Dutch Army Graves Services assembled in Bangkok and took over the records collected and collated by the ex-POW headquarters. 13 former POWs volunteered to remain in Thailand to assist with the search for the thousands of graves scattered along the railway. A diary of the subsequent search was written by one of these dedicated men, a British Army Padre H.C. Babb. This diary makes moving reading as Padre Babb describes the search in great detail, his reflections on and memories of his own captivity and the behavior of the new, quiescent, and obedient Japanese. This search commenced at Thambue Zayat on 24th September 1945 and concluded at Nakhon Prathong on 10th October with the recording of 10,549 graves in 144 cemeteries on or near the railway. The party failed to locate only 52 of the graves they were searching for. This is the original plan of the 82 Kilo cemetery. This plan shows the location of the cemetery, the position of each grave, and the full details of the person buried in each grave. Note: camps occupied by the groups working southwards from Thambue Zayat were referred to by the distance the camps were from Thambue Zayat. Example: 26 Kilo, 82 Kilo, and 105 Kilo. Diary entry for 26th September. Although the rain continued, we were forced to admit that the cemetery here was easily the best we had been shown so far, and there are good ones too. There are 12 graves here, 7 Dutch, 4 British, and 1 Australian. A decorated archway of bamboo and bright red flowers admitted us to the area where the graves are stone-cairned. The carved names on the crosses repainted in white. Padre Babb's diary for Friday, 5th October 1945 reads, "And a red flag has halted us at Kanyu, 162.4 kilometers. Near the station on the right of the line is a Japanese signpost. We walked 50 meters down a track, and there we found a long, narrow cemetery with 46 graves in it. There were 1 or 2 original crosses with names on them, 4 concrete crosses in perfect condition, and the others were new and made of bamboo." Plan of a cemetery drawn by Graves Relocation Party and a photograph of graves in Kansayok Jungle Cemetery, October 1945. Contact was then made by former POWs who had been with Sidney Peter Freeland when he died. Subsequent correspondence with his niece resulted in her kindly providing a photograph of a young man destined to rest eternally in Kanchanaburi War Cemetery, and of the cross, which first marked his final resting place. Freeland's grave cross. Sidney Peter Freeland, prior to leaving Australia in 1941. Headstone, marking Freeland's grave in Kanchanaburi War Cemetery. Freeland's grave marker after reburial in 1946. In all but a few cases, the war graves knew exactly whom they were exhuming and recorded where these men were buried. When the defeat of Japan became inevitable, plans were to recover and repatriate POWs from the many camps throughout Asia. This task was entrusted to a group formed in early 1945, the RAPWI, Repatriation of Allied Prisoners of War and Internees. At the time of the Japanese surrender, there were tens of thousands of Asians still forcibly employed on operating and maintaining the railway. It was quickly realized by the Allied officers still encamped in Kanchanaburi that, unless they took over control of the railway, many of the laborers would abandon their stations and force the closure of the railway. This would jeopardize the recovery of several hundred POWs still on the railway and the feeding and eventual recovery of more than 50,000 Asians. There is a reporter talking with former POWs. With the assistance of American and British undercover organizations already in place in Thailand and elsewhere, the repatriation went ahead quickly and smoothly. By the end of September 1945, more than 50,000 American, Australian, and British POWs were on their way home. Unfortunately, because of the political situation that had emerged in the Netherlands East Indies, after the surrender of the Japanese, 30,000 Dutch former POWs and civilians remained in camps until as late as 1947. Many of those freed from camps in Java were transported to Thailand to join their husbands or fathers. Here are Dutch children in the former POW camp at Tha Muang, Thailand, May 1946. When Allied military personnel entered areas in Southeast Asia formerly under Japanese control, they began recording what they found and saw. Some of the most poignant scenes recorded were those of the emaciated and sick Allied prisoners of war and Asian laborers. From the War Graves Party Diary, Friday, 28 September 1945. We came across a coolie on the railway line. He had 2 shocking ulcers covered by leaves. We found a dresser, which is a Tamil medical orderly, who was given bandages, linen, etc. to treat them. He will be able to save the poor fellow's leg if he takes care in the next fortnight. The dresser promises to do his best. The conditions of the POWs upon liberation. Liberty and life. To many prisoners, the end of the war did not come as a great surprise. Numerous groups within the railway workforce had been following the progress of world events by getting information from the many secret handmade radios. The local population was another source of news. The information was passed to the POWs in the form of notes dropped close to work parties or hidden in baskets or supplies delivered to camps, word whispered as people passed one another, or old newspapers being used to wrap supplies. What was surprising and of great relief was the sudden, unexpected Japanese surrender. This was not just a relief from purgatory, but also a narrow escape from certain death. Japanese High Command had issued orders that all Allied captives were to be killed in the event of Allied landings in the areas where POWs were held. This order was carried out in the Philippines and in Borneo. In Borneo, 2,400 Australian and British prisoners had suffered terrible privation and cruelty during the construction of an airfield at Sandakan. In January 1945, when the Japanese thought that an Allied attack against Borneo was imminent, they forced all the fit POWs still alive in Sandakan and Ranao were murdered. Only 6 men survived this massacre, all by escaping and being cared for by the natives. For the POWs in Thailand, it was to be several weeks after the surrender before real freedom came. Due to the suddenness of the Japanese surrender, it took time for the Allies to move men and equipment into the areas where POWs were held. During this period, food and medical supplies were parachuted into many of the camps. Here are POWs awaiting repatriation after the Japanese surrender. After the railway. By early 1944, almost all Allied POWs had been evacuated from the jungle camps to base camps and hospitals around Kanchanaburi. Of these, 550 died from the terrible effects of their ordeal on the railway. Throughout 1944, the Japanese shipped many of the fittest POWs to Japan to work in mines, factories, and foundries. As always, the Japanese refused to identify the ships carrying these prisoners, and many of the men died when the ships they were on were sunk by Allied submarines or planes. Solidly constructed huts in the camp at Nakhon Pathom. For most of those who remained in Thailand, conditions were much better than during the railway construction period. Better food, less work, and much reduced threat of disease meant that the death rate dropped dramatically, and men regained a degree of reasonable health. From February 1944 to August 1945, the number of deaths was Americans 5, Australians 113, British 440, Dutch 451. Of these, approximately 200 were killed during Allied bombing raids. From time to time, work parties were assembled and taken back to the railway to cut firewood, repair damage to the railway, or prepare defensive positions for the expected Allied attack against Thailand. Conditions for these groups were as bad as those during the construction of the railway. In May 1945, 1,000 men were taken from Nakhon Pathom camp to build a road from Prachuap Khirian to Murugui. 235 died. Likewise, many of the Asian laborers were evacuated to base camps around Kanchanaburi, but unlike the Allied prisoners of war, very little was done for them, and many thousands more died before the end of the war, 5,000 in one camp alone. POWs in Kanchanaburi camp. Cigarette paper sketches. These original sketches of Nong Pladuk camp were drawn on cigarette papers by 2360930 signalman Lionel Elkins. They were gifted to 2336933 Lance Corporal Norman Foster by Lionel before he was sent to work on the Murugui Road project, where he died on 8th August 1945. These prized drawings were taken home by Norman and remained with his family until being donated to TBRC by Peter Foster and his sister Felicity in January 2023 in memory of their father. A closer look at the drawings. And another look at the drawings. Peace of mind. These paintings of the three Tha Sao cemeteries were done by RQMS W. Rutherford of the 85th Anti-Tank Regiment, Royal Artillery. Subsequently, the padre responsible for any of the burials in these cemeteries, Captain C. Alcock, used the paintings as part of his records of the men who died in the Tha Sao camps and hospital. Note the grave numbers written in ink on the paintings. These and other records were used by the war graves parties post-war to assist with the identification of the bodies being exhumed from the many cemeteries along the railway prior to their reburial in one of today's three war cemeteries. St. Luke's Cemetery, Tha Sao. Cholera Cemetery, Tha Sao. St. George's Cemetery, Tha Sao. War cemeteries. 2 sets of war records were kept on the railway. The Japanese kept one complete set, as required by the Geneva Convention, and the POWs maintained another fragmented set. These comprised records for individual camps, work groups, or entire forces. All of these records were taken over by the Graves units in September 1945. After the War Graves Relocation Party completed its search for graves in October, the task of recovering the bodies from the jungle cemeteries commenced. Because of the size, more than 1,200 graves, and care with which the cemetery adjoining the Chung Kai Hospital camp had been developed, it was decided that Chung Kai Cemetery would remain. Likewise, the cemetery at the site at Thambu Zayat camp was selected to become the resting place of all the bodies recovered between Thambu Zayat and Nha The. A site had to be found for the bodies recovered along the southern portion of the railway, Nha The and Nakhon Pathom, and all other burial sites in Thailand. For convenience, an empty field adjacent to an old Chinese cemetery in Kanchanaburi was selected. The remains of almost 7,000 Allied servicemen were moved to this site. The bodies of small numbers of Americans who died on the railway were eventually returned to the U.S. for reburial. The end of the line. With the surrender of the Japanese, the countries of Southeast Asia returned to their formal imperial administrations. The British, not wanting a link from Thailand to Burma, removed a section of the railway south of the three pagodas as soon as the war graves parties completed the task of recovering the bodies from the jungle cemeteries. Prior to the severing of the line, a full cataloging of railway materials was carried out. All movable assets were then taken to one side of the border or the other, dependent on their source. All Burmese locomotives and rolling stock were taken to Burma, and equipment was taken from Malaya and Java, as well as all Japanese rolling stock was moved to Thailand. Some of the Malayan equipment was eventually returned to Malaya. The Allies decided that it would be too difficult and costly to dismantle the railway, so instructed Lieutenant Colonel Wormenhoven to prepare an evaluation of all assets of the railway in Thailand. These assets were then sold to Thailand. Proceeds of the sale, £1.25 million, were dispersed to the governments of the areas from which the Japanese had taken railway materials. Soon after Thailand took over control of the railway, the Minister for Communications stated that he would like to inspect the line. This trip commenced on 30th January 1947. The next morning, the group, ignoring all advice from the railway authorities, proceeded northwards until their trolley rounded a bend and crashed into a ravine where a trestle bridge had previously stood. The minister died soon after the accident. With the accident, so ended the use of the Death Railway until the railway department reopened the line from Nong Pladuk to Nam Tuk in 1956. Records. It is important for history that some of those involved with the events surrounding the railway kept records. During the railway project, it was possible to keep official records and rolls with the approval of the Japanese, provided such records were not critical of the Japanese. Many of these records were handed to Allied military authorities at the end of the war and are now held in various archives around the world. However, with paper and other materials in very short supply, it was difficult for most POWs to record their experiences in writing or drawings. Many substitute materials were used, bamboo and aluminum mess tins being common. There were also the threat of severe punishment being handed out by the Japanese should any of these diaries or drawings be discovered. Records were buried in tins or bottles and hidden in hollowed-out table legs or the bamboo frames of huts. Mess tins. These Australian and Dutch mess tins were inscribed by their owners as a means of recording different aspects of their POW life. Bamboo medical record. Because of the shortage of paper, doctors resorted to lengths of bamboo on which to write patients' medical records. There was one advantage on using bamboo. It was much more durable than paper and could be carried from camp to camp by the patient. This is the actual medical record of a Dutch prisoner of war, Mr. Emile Wagenaar. Remembrance. Relics. Even items left behind after an event can help explain the story of that event. To this end, the creator of this museum has spent more than 10 years locating and exploring the trace of the railway and more than 60 former POW campsites. The many hundreds of items recovered during numerous excavations reinforce the two different stories of the railway. Those items found along the route of the railway itself are those of its construction, use, and attempted destruction. These items are on display elsewhere in the museum and include construction tools, railway materials, and bomb fragments. The more tragic story of the railway is reinforced by the finding of personal effects around the former campsites. This is particularly so when a single site may yield hundreds of items, buckles, badges, coins, cigarette lighters, and personal items, which indicates that perhaps this is an area where cholera broke out and eventually had to be burned in an attempt to stop the spread of the disease. One such record is the set of 6 drawings made by a Dutch soldier, Gus van Rieden. Gus was captured on Java and transported to Thailand to work on the railway. He survived the railway construction period of 1943 and spent 1944 in camps in Kanchanaburi. At the end of 1944, he was sent back up the railway with others to carry out repair work. He fell sick and was confined to a makeshift hospital in Kui Yai camp. As Gus lay dying, he made pencil drawings to record his memories of the railway. The drawings were kept by a friend and given to Gus' widow in the Netherlands in 1954. The drawings of my father, Gus van Rieden, which he made with a sharp pencil and which were surprisingly well kept, in my opinion, not only show introspection, but also emotion and feeling, and the way friend and foe are drawn. Superficially, he sketched them with the same attention, but from the composition one can see the overwhelming feeling of insignificance of the human beings in the tremendous surround of nature. Herbert Van Rieden, 2004. The drawings are important for two reasons. Firstly, they are a record of the building of the railway made at the time. Perhaps more significantly, they show the state of mind of a man facing death and his lack of hatred of the Japanese. 6 images. The last is blurry. My apologies. Many useful or valuable items were destroyed because of the danger of spreading disease. Otherwise, many of the items on display here could have been sold or exchanged for food or medicines. The POWs became masters of make-do. This set of darts was made from handles of razors, nails, cardboard, and wood. The bowl of the pipe was carved from local hardwood. These items were donated by the widow of CQMS AC Branch of the British 18th Division. More items found at POW campsites. Marmite. There were times when even the most common foodstuff could make the difference between life and death. Marmite was one of these foods. Marmite is produced as a byproduct of yeast production and is well known to British and Australian people. It is high in vitamin and essential mineral content. Small doses of Marmite was a sure cure for many of the vitamin and mineral deficiency diseases suffered by POWs, beriberi, pellagra, and scabies being some. Doctors on the railway prescribed the limited supply of Marmite as a medicine, not as a food. A Dutch mess tin used to record the camps in which the man lived and the time spent in each. More items found in the former campsites, including belt buckles, parts of a rifle, a clamp, and a samurai sword. Soldier's sewing kit. Note the thimbles, buttons, etc. in the kit match those items, those recovered from POW campsites. Donated by the widow of CQMS AC Branch. Medicine bottles recovered from the rubbish pits of Chunkai and Hintok River POW campsites. Life-saving drugs that had to be purchased secretly and smuggled into the POW camps. Because the prisoners were supplied with very little by the Japanese, the medical staff was forced to improvise. This large sake bottle, taken from the Japanese garbage, was used as a saline mixing bottle. Note the graduation scratched on the side of the bottle. The green beer bottle, I don't have an image, was used as a saline drip unit. War criminals. After the Japanese surrendered in August 1945, Allied Command asked the former prisoners of war to report any cases of ill treatment or brutality by their captors. Identification parades of suspected war criminals were held, and those considered to have a case to answer were detained. A total of 120 Japanese and Koreans were subsequently tried for war crimes committed on the railway. Trials were carried out by the Allied governments of America, Australia, Britain, and the Netherlands. The pages below, which were taken from a British report, detail the sentences on some of the 111 convicted of war crimes. Of these, 32 received death sentences. An element of fairness can be inferred from the sentence imposed on Sergeant Watanabe, the Tiger. 1 day. Even though Sergeant Watanabe had been harsh in his treatment of POWs at Tonchan, he did not go beyond what was considered normal for the conditions prevailing on much of the railway. It was also recognized that he had tried, within his limited capacity, to improve living conditions for those in his charge. Those not executed served time in various Allied prisons until they were transferred to Sugamo Prison in Japan after the San Francisco Peace Settlement in 1951. All prisoners still in prison in 1956 were paroled. The British trial notes, and 12 of the worst war criminals. Major Chida, 8 years. Sergeant Major Urakawa, life. Sergeant Watanabe Seikichi, 1 day, the tiger. Lieutenant Takasaki, death, the frog. Kaneshiro, he's a Korean, death, he was the undertaker. Sergeant Major Ada, death. Corporal Tarakoshi, death, commuted. Private Noguchi, death. Motoyama, Korean, death, commuted to life. He was the Black Prince. Sergeant Major Hinamatsu, death. Colonel Sugasawa, 12 years. Another railway. By 1944, the Japanese were desperate for raw materials for its war-based industries. They were not able to increase production from their domestic mines, so looked to the areas under their control. A possible source for high-quality coal was from mines in Sumatra. Some years before, the Dutch had considered constructing a railway from Pakan Baro to join an existing railway which linked Moera with the port of Padang on the west coast to exploit these deposits. The project did not proceed because of the very difficult terrain and the tropical jungle vegetation. As with the better-known Thailand-Burma Railway, these difficulties did not deter the Japanese. They had an almost inexhaustible supply of expendable labor, the Allied prisoners of war, and Asians from the captured territories. The first of 4,000 POWs arrived in May 1944 to start work on the 220-kilometer railway. Of these, approximately 700 died by the time the railway was completed in August 1945. Of the 100,000 Romusha, mostly from Java, forced to work on the railway from 1943, as many as 70,000 may have died. 2 of the ships transporting laborers to the railway were sunk by British submarines. Of the 6,500 prisoners on the Junyu Maru, fewer than 900 were rescued by the Japanese, with many of those winding up on the railway. More than 1,000 of the 1,200 on board the Harukiki Maru were saved when the ship was sunk. Images from the Sumatra Death Railway. The track of the Sumatra Death Railway. Ronald Melvin Merton, RAF. Born December 20th, London, England. Captured on 15th March 1942 and imprisoned in camps in Batavia. He was transferred to Jayakarta with around 300 other POWs to Pekanbaru in Sumatra to build the other death railway, the Sumatra Railway. Died March 4th, 1965, Montreal, Quebec, Canada. He was suffering the effects of his ill health while in captivity and caused melanoma. Thank you. The creator of this center wishes to thank the following for their invaluable assistance in this important project. Mr. Andy Guest for his support in turning a dream into a reality. Mr. Pornsack Praiser Fall for having sufficient belief in this project to assist in the purchase of the land and erection of the building. Mr. Hugh Cope for managing the center during its formative years. The Royal Netherlands Embassy for its assistance in completing several galleries. To Mr. Renishi Sugarno for his contribution to the pictorial content of the center. And all others who maintain their faith in this project and helped in so many ways, no matter how small. Your support has been greatly appreciated, and without it, the Thailand-Burma Railway Centre may not have been possible, and my dream may have remained just a dream. I thank you sincerely, Rod Beatty. Now we will leave the museum and take a look at other sites in the local area. The first stop is the group of buildings that were the headquarters of the Kimbitai, the Japanese secret military police, and the wartime mint, which printed the money used in Thailand during the Japanese occupation. More of this building complex and abandoned fountain. This area became better known through the recent movie, The Railway Man. The Railway Man was a 2013 war film directed by Jonathan Teplitsky. It is an adaptation of the 1995 autobiography of the same name by Eric Lomax and stars Colin Firth, Nicole Kidman, Jeremy Irvine, and Stellan Skarsgård. In the movie, Lomax was a signalman captured in the fall of Singapore and is transported to work on the Death Railway. His leadership in creating a makeshift radio results in extreme abuse by the Kimbitai in the main office of this military secret police building, in their main office here in Kanchanaburi. Here is the building complex again. This is the set of monuments erected in 2023 for the civilian laborers who died working on the railway. During World War II, from 1941 to 1945, Japan had built railways and roads connecting Siam and Burma through difficult terrains for military purposes. More than 100,000 of workers had been conscripted from the occupied areas in Southeast Asia, predominantly Tamils brought from South India to work in the rubber plantations of Malaya. They endured very harsh and inhumane working conditions, causing uncountable deaths due to overwork, ill treatment, malnutrition, and diseases like cholera, malaria, and dysentery. The total number of those who perished is unknown, but estimated to be well in excess of 100,000. Thousands upon thousands of them had been abandoned as orphans in mass graves in the jungles of Siam and Burma, and lost without any trace. This monument, built over the remains of tens of thousands of workers abandoned under Siamese soils, stands as a testament of the ordeals of workers, lest we forget. This Nadukal was funded and co-sponsored by the government of Tamil Nadu, India, through Thailand Tamil Sangam, TTS. The other side. Project initiated, conceived, co-sponsored, and executed by Malaysians and Indians in Bangkok, MIB. Nadukal unveiled on 1st May 2024. More on the main monument. Monument inauguration ceremony, Brigadier General, retired Assistant Professor Dr. Surin Jampian, President of Kanchanaburi Tourist Business Association, Monument co-founder. Fra Samanam Thirachan, Permanent Secretary, Anam Nikaya, Abbot of Wat Davorm Waram Wat Yuan, Kanchanaburi, Thailand. Monument co-founder. Chandrasekaran Ponnusamy, President of Death Railway Interest Group, Malaysia, Monument co-founder. The tourist attraction map for the bridge on the River Kwai area. Crossing the bridge on the River Kwai. And the small station stop at the far side of the bridge, abandoned. The main office of the recently abandoned Museum of a Prisoner of War Camp display. Walking along the bridge on the far side, as it eventually connects to the regular rail line. On the right is the abandoned Prisoner of War Camp Museum and Festival area, And on the left is a Buddhist temple complex, as we are facing back to Kanchanaburi and returning to the main small town area at the bridge. The abandoned prisoner of war camp museum and festival area in front of it. This area, by the way, was never a location of a POW camp. The ones for Kanchanaburi were all on the town side of the bridge. The Buddhist temple area and large Buddha on the other side, at the far side of the bridge. Next is for the Japanese cenotaph. More than 1,000 Japanese soldiers and their allies died in the construction of the bridge as well. This monument was erected by the then Japanese Army in February 1944, during World War II, in memory of the personnel of the Allied forces together with other people who died during the construction of the Thailand-Burma Railway. Once a year in March, voluntary members of the Japanese community in Thailand assemble here to hold a memorial ceremony for those who died. A point to remember is that the battles of Kohima and Imphal were in August of that year, and the Japanese army in Burma and Thailand were still not defeated yet. They still had confidence that they were winning the war, even though the war at sea and through the island hopping campaigns had already reversed Japanese fortunes elsewhere. The cenotaph displays and the main monument for the Japanese, as well as their allied troops in separate corner shrines.
Wanted to put this thing up mentioning
Kohima was in August 1944, so this is February.
and
So they still think
the okay. Well, it obviously was used because they repulsed them, but I mean, I think it's just because they all starved to death. They didn't have any food, the Japanese.
a lot of that.
Yeah, a lot of that.
And,
Okay.
and at the Battle of Kohima, the guys wouldn't break. In the Battle of the Administration Box, he had my box, the guys also wouldn't break. Unlike the defenses of Singapore. This monument was erected by the then Japanese Army in February 1944. Many months before the Battle of Kohima, they still felt that they could still win. During World War II, in memory of the personnel of the Allied forces, together with other people who died during the construction of the Thailand-Burma Railway. Once a year in March, voluntary members of the Japanese community in Thailand assemble here to hold a memorial ceremony for those who died. monument for the Vietnamese and Cambodian soldiers who served in the Japanese army. Here is a monument put up by the Japanese in memory of deceased prisoners of war. Here is yet another monument for soldiers who served in the Japanese military. The Japanese army was also a multicultural.
This is Yasko signing the Japanese Monument guest book. Views of the town near the bridge. More of the town near the bridge. And here is a final look at the bridge on the River Kwai.